My husband handed me a gift bag across the dinner table and said, "I need you to do something for me Saturday. Something that matters." Inside the bag was a bottle of Veuve Clicquot and a card that read, in his handwriting, "For my gracious wife who always does the right thing." 3 days later, I stood in his business partner's living room, in front of his partner's husband, and I did exactly what he asked. I just made sure the right thing looked nothing like what he'd imagined. Husband's ultimatum came on a Thursday evening in October. We were sitting at our kitchen island, the kind of ordinary domestic scene that looks peaceful from the outside. Leftover pasta, the news murmuring in the background, his laptop open beside his plate because it was always open beside his plate. He looked up at me with that expression I'd come to recognize over the past year. Patient, slightly pained. The expression of a man who believed he was being reasonable while everything around him proved otherwise. "Nadia deserves an apology," he said. "You know that." I set down my fork. "For what, exactly?" "For the way you spoke to her at the Hendersons' dinner. She was humiliated." I had spoken plainly to his business partner at a dinner party 6 weeks earlier. Nothing cruel, nothing untrue. I had simply stopped pretending I didn't notice what everyone in that room was pretending not to notice. And now my husband, the man I'd been married to for 7 years, was sitting across from me asking me to apologize for it. "If I don't," I asked. He closed his laptop. That was how I knew he meant it. "Then I don't know if I can keep doing this with you." I looked at him for a long moment. Then I said, "Fine. Set it up." Before I tell you what happened Saturday, I need to take you back to the beginning. Because none of this makes sense without understanding how a woman who trusted her instincts completely managed to spend 3 years convincing herself those instincts were wrong. My name is Laurel, and for 7 years I thought I had a solid marriage. My husband, I'll call him my husband because that's what he was for a long time, and names matter less than roles in a story like this, was a civil engineer who ran a small but successful infrastructure consulting firm. We met at a fundraiser for a children's hospital, the kind of event where you're supposed to mingle, but mostly stand near the appetizers, hoping someone interesting finds you first. He found me. We talked for 2 hours. He was funny in a dry, self-deprecating way that I found genuinely disarming, and he remembered, 3 weeks later on our first real date, that I'd mentioned wanting to try a specific ramen place in the East Village. He'd made a reservation. We married when I was 32. I was a licensed architect working at a mid-sized firm in the city. He was 37. We bought a row house in a neighborhood with good schools, even though we didn't have children yet and weren't sure we would. We had dinner parties in a vegetable garden that never quite worked and a dog named after a jazz musician. We were, by every external measure, doing well. Looking back, I can tell you exactly when the cracks started. Not a dramatic moment, not a confrontation or a discovery, just a Tuesday afternoon, 14 months into our marriage, when my husband came home from a networking event and mentioned, almost as a footnote to a longer story about a potential contract, that he'd reconnected with an old colleague. "Nadia Forsyth," he said, carrying his briefcase through to the mudroom. "We overlapped at Whitmore & Associates years ago. She's starting her own firm, actually. Commercial real estate development. Really sharp. I told her we should grab coffee, maybe talk about a referral arrangement. I didn't think anything of it. Why would I? He had professional relationships across the city. He was good at networking, good at keeping those connections warm. If anything, I was glad. He'd been talking about diversifying the firm's client base for months. The coffee meeting happened. Then another one. Then Nadia started appearing in his stories the way a new song gets stuck in your head before you realize you've been humming it for days. Nadia thinks the Hudson Yards expansion is overextended. Nadia closed a deal on a mixed-use property in Hoboken that everyone said was too complicated. Nadia has a contact at the Port Authority who might be useful. I nodded. I asked follow-up questions. I was happy for him. The first boundary crossed so quietly I almost missed it entirely. My husband and I had standing Saturday morning plans. Farmers market, coffee, sometimes a long walk through Riverside Park if the weather allowed. It was one of those small rituals that feels insignificant until it disappears. One Saturday in early spring, he texted me from the bedroom. We were both already awake, to say he was going to meet Nadia for breakfast instead. She was having a hard week. He'd explain later. He did explain later. Her lease negotiation on a new office space had fallen through, and she was stressed. He'd wanted to be a supportive colleague. I said that was fine, and it was that time. But the breakfasts became a pattern. Not every Saturday, but enough that I started to notice the calendar. Then came the late calls, professional, he said. Always professional, because commercial real estate doesn't respect business hours. Then came the first time I was introduced to her at a rooftop party thrown by mutual acquaintances in June, and I understood immediately why I'd been unsettled. Nadia Forsyth was the kind of woman who fills a room not with volume but with attention. She was 41, effortlessly put together in linen and gold jewelry, with the kind of easy confidence that comes from decades of being the smartest person in rooms that underestimated her. She greeted my husband with a warmth that was just a degree past collegial. When he introduced us, she shook my hand and said, "I've heard so much about you," in a tone that managed to imply the opposite. Her husband, a quiet man who taught high school history, stood slightly behind her with the expression of someone who'd learned to be peripheral. I recognized that expression because I'd been wearing it at my own dinner table for months without quite realizing it. Over the next year and a half, the pattern deepened in increments I kept explaining away. My husband began consulting Nadia on decisions that had nothing to do with real estate. Financial planning, hiring, even once, surreally, the renovation plans for our guest bathroom. She has good taste, he said, when I asked why he'd sent her the contractor's drawings. He shared details of our marriage with her. I discovered this gradually, in the way you discover water damage, noticing the edge before you find the source. Once, during an argument about whether to spend Thanksgiving with my family or his, he said something that stopped me cold. "Nadia thinks it's important to establish your own traditions as a couple." I stared at him. He didn't seem to notice he'd said it. The night that broke something open for me happened 8 months before that Thursday ultimatum. We were at the Hendersons' dinner. 12 people around a long table, good wine, the kind of evening that should have been simple. Nadia and her husband were there. Partway through the main course, my husband leaned over and refilled Nadia's glass without asking, without looking at me, in the automatic way you do something for someone whose preferences have become muscle memory. Her husband noticed. I noticed. Nobody said anything. After dinner, while the men moved to the living room, I ended up alone with Nadia in the kitchen for a few minutes. She was cutting into a tart, relaxed, and at home in a way that suggested she'd been in similar situations many times. And something in me just stopped. "You're very close with my husband," I said. Not accusing, just stating. She looked up. Her expression didn't change exactly, but something behind it shifted. "We work well together. You work together on one referral arrangement that hasn't produced a single signed contract," I said still calmly. "You have breakfast with him twice a month. He consults you about our home renovations. He tells you things about our marriage. That's not a professional relationship, Nadia." The silence lasted maybe 4 seconds. Then she set down the knife and said, "I think you might be misreading things." "I think you know I'm not," I said. That was it. That was the entire conversation. Nothing raised, nothing cruel, nothing I would take back. My husband found out. Nadia told him, presumably within hours, and by the time we got home that night, he was furious. Not quietly furious, visibly, pacing the kitchen, furious. I had embarrassed him. I had insulted his colleague. I had let my insecurity poison what was, for the 1,000th time, just a friendship. Wasn't I tired of doing this? I had been asking myself that same question. Not whether I was right. I was right. And the part of me that had been doing this work for years knew it. But whether I was tired enough to stop. Whether the energy of fighting reality was more exhausting than just accepting it. I was not yet tired enough, but I was getting there. The months between that dinner and my husband's ultimatum were a slow erosion. Every time I tried to name what I was watching happen, he had a reframe ready. I wasn't perceptive, I was paranoid. I wasn't setting a boundary, I was being controlling. I wasn't protecting my marriage, I was sabotaging it. He had an answer for everything, and each answer arrived in the patient, slightly pained tone of a man who had been very, very reasonable for a very, very long time. I started therapy in August, not for the marriage, for myself. My therapist, a pragmatic woman in her 50s who had clearly heard versions of this story before, said something in our third session that I kept turning over in my mind for weeks afterward. The most effective kind of gaslighting is when the other person has convinced themselves they're telling the truth. I thought about that a lot as the leaves changed, and the October ultimatum arrived. When my husband said I owed Nadia an apology and handed me that bottle of champagne like a stage prop, I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I said, fine, set it up, and then I spent the next 48 hours very quietly preparing for a different conversation than the one he was expecting. I want to be honest about those 2 days, because I've questioned my own motives more times than I can count since then. There was a part of it that was cold and tactical, and I don't want to dress that up as something pure. But there was also a part of it that was just done. Done performing confusion I didn't feel. Done apologizing for having eyes. And there was Nadia's husband. I thought about him a lot. He taught high school history at a school in the Bronx, a 20-minute subway ride from the kind of dinner parties where his wife was the center of gravity and he stood slightly behind her. I had seen the look on his face when my husband refilled her glass. He'd been wearing that look, I now realized, every single time I'd seen him. I found his email address through the school's directory. I sent him a message on Friday afternoon with a subject line that just said, "Saturday evening. Please read this." I told him I had been asked to come to their apartment to apologize to his wife, and that I would be there at 7. I told him I thought there were things he deserved to know. I told him the decision about what to do with that information was entirely his. He wrote back 40 minutes later. 3 words, "I'll be home." Saturday morning I made coffee, took the dog for a long walk, and did not think about what I was going to say. I already knew what I was going to say. I spent the walk thinking about the vegetable garden instead, and whether we'd tried planting the tomatoes too early, and whether any of that would still be my garden in 6 months. My husband and I drove to their apartment on the Upper West Side in near silence. He was in a good mood, or performing one, which by then amounted to the same thing. He'd already texted Nadia that afternoon to confirm. She'd responded with a string of emojis that I saw over his shoulder. A champagne glass, a heart, a small pink flower. He didn't put his phone away fast enough. The apartment was exactly what I expected. Clean lines, expensive art, a living room staged, with the confidence of someone who cared about being seen as tasteful. Nadia opened the door in cashmere and heeled boots for a Saturday evening at home. She kissed my husband on the cheek. She offered me a warm, forgiving smile that told me she'd already written the ending to this evening. Her husband came out of the kitchen. He looked at me directly, briefly, and I saw in his face the same thing I'd felt for 2 days. Not quite ready, but ready enough. We sat. There was a cheese plate. There was wine already poured. My husband settled into the armchair across from them, looking like a man who had finally, after enormous patience, gotten what he'd been owed. He gave me a small, encouraging nod. "You've got this." I almost laughed. I set my glass on the coffee table. I looked at Nadia. I said, "I want to start by saying that my husband is right." She straightened slightly. Her expression softened toward gracious. "I do owe you an apology." My husband exhaled, his shoulders dropped a full inch. But not for what he thinks. The room changed. It didn't get louder or more dramatic in the first few seconds. It just changed temperature, the way a room does right before a storm. "I owe you an apology for waiting as long as I did to say any of this plainly." I turned to her husband. I said his name, a name I'd barely used in the years I'd known him because neither of us had ever really been asked to be present in the same room. And I told him I was sorry that what I was about to say was going to be hard to hear in company. I told him I had tried to find a gentler way, and I hadn't found one, and I had decided the gentleness wasn't mine to prioritize anymore. Then I said what I had come to say. I told him about the Saturday breakfasts over the past 2 years, the ones his wife had described to my husband as just catching up, The pattern of them, the consistency, the way they had quietly replaced the Saturday mornings my husband and I used to share. I told him about the late evening calls. I told him about the renovation drawings my husband had sent her, and the Thanksgiving argument she'd apparently weighed in on, and the night at the Hendersons when my husband had refilled her glass without looking at me. I said, I want to be precise here. I am not telling you something physical has happened. I'm telling you that for at least 2 years, your wife has been the primary emotional relationship in my husband's life. I'm telling you that he consults her before he consults me. I'm telling you that he has shared the private details of our marriage with her while telling me I was imagining things. I had printed 4 pages from my own phone, screenshots of text exchanges I'd found 9 weeks earlier, the night I'd picked up my husband's phone to show him a photo, and his message thread was already open. I had said nothing then. I had waited. I had documented. I slid the pages across the coffee table. They were texts between my husband and Nadia, not explicit. That, in a way, made them worse. They were the texts of 2 people who had built an entire interior world that was not meant for their spouses. References to private jokes I didn't know existed. Her describing a fight with her husband and my husband responding, he doesn't understand what he has. My husband writing at 11:30 on a Tuesday night while I thought he was finishing a proposal, sometimes I think about what it would have been like if we'd met first. Her response, after a pause long enough to suggest she'd considered it carefully. Let's not go there, but I know what you mean. My husband was on his feet before her husband had finished reading the first page. This is insane, he said. His voice had the quality of someone performing outrage to cover for the fact that outrage was the only move left. You went through my phone. You printed private messages. Do you understand what you've done here? I looked at him. I felt, for the first time in a long time, completely steady. I understand exactly what I've done. You've destroyed everything over a friendship. You destroyed it, I said. I'm just the one saying so out loud. Her husband set the pages down on the coffee table. He didn't say anything for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was controlled in the way that things are controlled when the alternative is coming completely apart. He looked at his wife. He said, the Tuesday nights you said were late client dinners. She opened her mouth. He said, don't. My husband tried again. He turned to her husband with the palms-up gesture of a man trying to de-ace a situation entirely of his own creation. He said their conversations were professional, that the tone of those texts was just how they talked, that I was taking fragments out of context and weaponizing them because I had never been comfortable with him having close friendships outside the marriage. Her husband said quietly, he told you we needed to cut back on spending this spring. We pushed back our anniversary trip because of it. He was not talking to my husband. He was talking to his wife. He spent money on you, she said his name. He said it again. He spent money on you while telling me we needed to cut back. In the transcript of my own interior life, this is the moment I knew it was over. Not my marriage, though that too, but the whole architecture of pretending. You can gaslight a person for years if they are only fighting their own perceptions. You cannot gaslight a person when someone else is sitting across the room, reading the same pages and arriving at the same conclusions. I stood up. I smoothed my jacket. I said, I've sent you copies of everything to the email address on the school website. I'm sorry it happened this way. I genuinely am. My husband grabbed my arm at the door. He said my name, then said it again softer, trying to find the right register, first the authoritative one, then the wounded one. We could talk about this. We can fix this, please. I looked at his hand on my arm until he let go. I'm not angry anymore, I told him. That's not why I did this. I did this because he deserved to know. And because I'm done living inside a version of our life that only exists to make you comfortable. I took the elevator down alone. The doorman held the building door for me. The street was loud and bright and October cold, and I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, breathing it in before I called a car. The ride home took 22 minutes. I watched the park go by in the dark and thought about nothing in particular, which was itself a kind of miracle. My husband came home at midnight. He had clearly been crying, which was the second time I had ever seen that. He tried 3 different versions of the conversation: the angry one, the bargaining one, the quiet one where he sat across from me and said he'd made mistakes and asked if we could find a way through. I listened to all of them. He wasn't lying in any of them. People who gaslight often aren't. They've rewritten the story so many times they've started to believe the revision. I said, "I need you to sleep somewhere else tonight." He slept in the guest room. I lay in our bed with the dog at my feet and felt the specific texture of an ending I had known was coming for 2 years and had finally stopped running from. I saw a divorce attorney on Monday. She was recommended by a colleague who'd been through something similar and described her as someone who doesn't flinch. She reviewed the texts, the pattern of behavior I'd documented, the financial record I'd started compiling in September. She was matter-of-fact in the way I needed someone to be matter-of-fact. "He'll say you violated his privacy," she told me. "He had an open message thread on a shared device," I said. "He'll say you waited to make it public and that was deliberate." "It was deliberate," I said. "That doesn't make it wrong." She looked at me over her reading glasses. "No," she said, "it doesn't." 3 weeks after that Saturday, I received a text from an unsaved number. I almost didn't open it. It said, "This is Nadia's husband. I wanted to tell you that I filed on Monday and that I'm sorry for what you're going through. I know it doesn't help, but I've been thinking about it for 2 years, and you weren't wrong." I sat with that text for a long time. I wrote back, "I'm sorry too. You deserved to know sooner. Take care of yourself." The divorce took 8 months. My husband was not cruel in the proceedings, which I had prepared for and which didn't come. He was, more than anything, diminished, a man who had believed he was holding 2 worlds together and discovered, once both were gone, that he had actually been standing in neither. I heard from mutual friends that he and Nadia tried for a while to turn what they'd had into something real, that it lasted less than 5 months, that the dynamic that had felt so charged and special in the margins of other people's lives turned out to need the margins to survive. I wasn't surprised. The things people protect most fiercely are usually the things that can't survive being looked at directly. I kept the dog. I kept the row house, which was in my name from the original purchase because his credit had a gap that year, and it had made more sense. I replanted the vegetable garden in April with a neighbor who knew what she was doing, and for the first time in 3 years, the tomatoes actually came in. Nadia's husband and I have had coffee twice, once in December, once in February. Both times we talked mostly about things that had nothing to do with either of our marriages. His students, my current projects, a documentary we had, both apparently watched separately, and arrived at different conclusions about. He is a quieter kind of company than I'm used to, and I don't know yet what shape that is, or whether it's anything at all. We are both, I think, practicing the same thing: how to trust a perception again after someone spent years telling you your perceptions couldn't be trusted. I think about that Saturday sometimes. About the way my husband handed me that champagne bottle like a peace offering, already certain of the terms of peace. About the look on Nadia's face when the apology turned in a direction she hadn't prepared for. About her husband's hands going very still on those pages. My husband wanted me to kneel in that living room and confirm that he was reasonable and I was the problem. I understand now that it was never really about Nadia's feelings. It was about getting me to say in front of a witness that I had been wrong to see what I saw, that my years of accurate perception had been nothing but insecurity, that I would accept whatever version of the story he needed me to accept. I didn't do that. I told the truth in the room where he'd set up my humiliation and let the truth do what it does in enclosed spaces. There are women who stay quiet because the noise of speaking up costs more in the short term than they think they can afford. I know because I was one of them for 2 years. I nodded at dinner parties. I accepted the patient, pained tone. I revised my perceptions downward until they barely resembled what I had actually seen. And then one Thursday evening, my husband handed me a gift bag and asked me to do the right thing, so I did.